Going live. Am I live yet? We are live. Hello, I'm Andy B. How are we doing? Today will be a short discussion about some random thoughts upon DNA, among other questions that might come up during my ramble. This will be a long rambly video. This may be a very disjointed sort of presentation, so forgive me for that. This is live, running and gunning. This won't be edited. So where do I start? Do I start from human beings or do I start from DNA? One of the two. So human beings, let's start there. We as animals, so to speak, interact with one another, and during those interactions we come to the choice that we may want to create other humans. I think that is a very deep instinctual impulse that's driven by something. So how do we get there? Well, first we look at other animals. What do they do that in relation is the same behavior as human beings, who we think are somewhat different from animals in a certain way? Well, it would seem that living things work upon the sensory information that they receive, and they develop some sort of language, whether that's noises or some sort of sign language or display or coloration, to show off that they are adaptive or knowledgeable about what's interacting with them, and they want to communicate it to other animals, whether that be within a sort of tribe or collection of the same animal, or whether they wish to communicate that to other animals. And so, where does that drive come from? That want to communicate or express or show off some kind of message to other animals of the same or different kind. So, trailing back to this singular point. So you have human beings who communicate, and we came up with a language to communicate because we want to interact with concepts, so to speak. We conceptualize everything. That's what I think words are. Singular communications of a perception in a context, which I would say is a concept. And from that concept, you have something you can judge that brings you to a realization. And from those realizations, you have principles upon which you act. And the want to act, or the will, is driven by that interaction, that kind of symbiosis with each other. That knowledge that we are social, that sociability. And that sociability isn't a tangible. And so, back to my previous video about answers for atheists, or answering questions for theists rather, I would call that God. That's what I characterize as God. The intangible that we know has an effect, but has no ability to act other than to cause effect. So there's that. So going back, animals kind of do the same thing. They develop a language of sorts, however that may come about, and they display to each other that they wish to have interactions to be socially interactive with each other, to form some sort of cohesion that leads to an outcome. And this is getting back to the naturalist argument, I suppose. I'll get there eventually. Firstly, plants. Plants are a weird one, because we see it in plants as well. They develop some sort of language, whether that be a pheromone or some collection of chemicals like a spore, or something that they take out and then transmit back through the roots, or their coloration, or what time of day they open. Their flowering, that's a communication of sorts. You could argue. Whether that's a valid argument, I don't know. Just spouting an idea. Just a theory. So it all comes back to where they stemmed off from, which organism exactly separated into plants versus animals. Not versus, but plants and animals came about from a singular point that separated either way, according to evolution, or the theory thereof. And so if it comes down to the first ever branch of anything, which I would say is at its most basic form of anything living, we know that that's RNA, which is a kind of messenger. It's an instruction. And if that instruction was created, came together, formed, however you want to describe it, why did it form the way it did? And this is the basis of the question. Out of all the randomness and chance and things that happen to be, things that could exist and did exist and were there at the time, why did they interact in such a way that created a message that formed an organism to communicate that message? And then why was that message to replicate? And in that replication, why would it change and adapt? Why did it not just stay as a singular organism? And why didn't that singular organism just sit as it was and eventually die out when it came into contact with something that killed it? What was that impulse that was built into RNA that communicated the need to be more than one? Why did the first ever thing that could do what it did? Obviously, somewhere in DNA, there was a coordinated impulse to replicate something. So how did RNA come together with another bit of RNA, specifically that created DNA? And then what was it about that instructed something that could use what it had in its environment to achieve replication? And then in that replication, why did it can't DNA, we think that DNA can't think. It has no consciousness, it has no recognition of the things around it. We think of it as like a rock or glass or metal or something that's elemental, that is unique within itself, that only ever changes through the interactions it has with other things that have no will to act. They have no brain, they have no sensory perception, they have no decision-making ability. So how did it do it? And why did it do it the way it did? Because if that's random and happenstance and just came to be by chance, then why do things think? Where did thought come from? When did we go from cells with a nucleus with a DNA instruction to form the way they do, to act the way they do in order to do what they do? And then why is that to replicate? And why, through interaction with other things, do they change exactly what they replicate or give birth to or split into? Why? This is the sticky point from the very first thing. Why? The contemplation that you could say is a theistic contemplation only. I don't know if atheists contemplate this. I don't know if naturalists contemplate this. I'm not versed on the labels that people give to their entirety of their outlook on things, but from what I understand of the naturalist argument, that all things are purely physical interactions between electrical radiation, ions, and neutrons and protons, anything that can form an ionic bond to anything else. What was it about that, if not driven by something that could make a decision, that made it fall into the exact place to create something that could? Because we see that in plants, they interact with their environment by having the ability to sense. They know when it's hot, they know when it's cold, they know when the sun's out and when it's dark. And something in plants drew them to grow towards sunlight, whether that was just an abundance thereof, and so they expanded into that abundance. Why did they need water to transport minerals, salts, what have you, out of the soil into themselves? What made them want to communicate with each other? Why was pollination such a priority to them? Why was that need to replicate such a priority, that they developed a symbiotic language with other things that could assist in that, whether that be spores that blow in the air? That seems to be completely random. How do they know that they're going to be in a place with other plants if they can't sense other plants? And how do those spores know what message to deliver? How do seeds come about? And how do ovums come about? What exactly triggers the exact passing on of what we could call chromosomes or instructional information in order to form another being? And if in that passing on you're only purely replicating what you can give, there has to be an interaction with something that alters that DNA in order to bring about something else, in order for evolution to happen. So in that happening, because things moved environments or came into an abundance of some other thing that interacted with it in some sort of way, how does it, if it's not selective and it purely happens by chance, why do things persist? That's my question. What is this persistence, this want to replicate, this want to carry on and produce others of yourself? And why in human beings with our somewhat advanced thinking minds did we communicate language to pass on principles to act upon? Why do we wish to communicate principles? Is there something about DNA inherently in its structure from wherever it had available to be constructed that gave it some sort of ability to know what to latch onto? Because obviously it has to receive a signal, and then it has to know what that signal means, what to do with it, how it can use it to its advantage. And if it has no consciousness, it has no thought, it's purely electrochemical interactions with whatever is in the same environment, what is it that gives those electrochemical signals the qualities they have in order to trigger the results they produce? This is the sticky point. To me, personally, it can't be just random. It can't be just chance. It can't be that you leave something in an environment and eventually it adapts. Because we know that DNA changes, and that when DNA can be changed, it can be altered, it can be fiddled with by introducing different things to it. And we could estimate that the proteins that form DNA, when we apply something to them that causes them to change, we can manipulate them in such a way that makes them do something else. But we don't know what they will do until it does it. If you alter one part of DNA and it produces a different result, you don't know that that change in it is producing that result until you can replicate it. So as human beings, we know that in replication, if you want to achieve change, you have to introduce something that will change, and then you have to be able to replicate that change. You have to know that that change can be successfully replicated by itself if it has a way to replicate, either via an ovum or a seed or interjection with CRISPR technology or something. We know that, but how does DNA know that? How did RNA go to DNA, and how did DNA go into separating or replicating itself? And how did it know, apart from persisting and being able to replicate further, if that's all there is, that what it was doing would be beneficial? Because it would seem that if it happens by randomness and chance and just whatever's interacting with it, and then it decides to replicate and it's changed in a way that makes the other organism that it produces fail, how does it know to not replicate that? It can't know. It doesn't know. It just happens. So what makes that happen? And why do we see things? Because we go on about mate selection. Now, mate selection in animals is quite clear. You pick the nearest available thing to mate with, whatever animal that may be, and then you make the exchange of the things that cause an ovum to be instructed to go on and replicate itself into whatever organism it's going to form. And there is somewhat of a selection being on how strong something is. In animals, if there's a hierarchy, where in the hierarchy order it is. In plants, I'm guessing it's just proximity and chance interaction of whatever bumps into it, catches its pollen, dissipates whatever it's exchanging DNA with and then delivers it. You need the organ to be able to do it. That's another fascinating thing. Why did male and female come about? When did DNA, if that's the building block of all natural living things, when did it decide that there should be a male and a female? Why should there be one thing that receives and one thing that transmits? Why do we see that in plants and animals? What was it about DNA that made that? I can't see any reason for it. If DNA can form a singular cell organism that through a process separates into another organism that is a direct copy of itself, why would you ever need male and female? Why aren't we all asexual hermaphrodites that can just produce a fertilized egg or seed that comes into being and knows to do it itself? Why can't we do that? Why isn't everything like that? And then why the specific organs that it uses to do it? Why the stamen and the other thing, I've forgotten what it is. Why the penis and the vagina? Why the external laying of eggs and then spermatophore over that? What selects for the way things breed and replicate? And everybody can say environment, whatever works best in that environment, but that would seem to be a process. Because if the first thing doesn't work and the species dies out, what use is that? So it has to be replicating. So somewhere it must have created a number of different changes that each formed something, and then whatever was most successful happened, and then because it was successful, it retained that quality. Because obviously that's the information that's passed on when whatever it does replicates. But then why change environment? Why move to a place where you interact with other things that made the DNA do different things, that made it form other things? How did evolution happen? By chance and randomness. If whatever was passing on the messaging to form the new being couldn't disperse, was only moved by the current of water to begin with, or blown in the air and then randomly settled, because if things randomly settle, obviously they're going to land in environments that are hostile to them. How did they land in environments that were beneficial to them? How do we find species that work anywhere in the world? How do we know that the differences between species of anything, or genus, whatever you want to call it? How do we know that they weren't abundant in one area? Suddenly there was a natural happening that removed them from one area, and suddenly they ended up in another area. How did that all happen by chance and randomness? I think there is something about the formation of DNA from RNA that has some sort of consciousness to it, a knowing. Because otherwise, how would you know what to replicate, and how would you know what to discard? How would you know to move from the environment you're in? How would you know what abundance or a lack of something is? How does whatever that isn't conscious know that forms death? And then why would you move away from the environment or whatever the thing you're interacting with is in order to not die? Yeah, some questions. Anyway, that's going to be the end of my rant on DNA. I hope that someone can come back with some answers or interact with that in whatever way they wish. And I look forward to any interaction that this video gets. Please leave a like, comment, subscribe if you like the weird rambling ideas and the exploration thereof. And if you find them that entertaining that you'll want to support the creation of more, there is a Streamlabs link in the description below. So thank you very much, and good morning.